Hello and welcome to the Virtual Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester and I'm the director of the Hammer's public programs, and I want to welcome you all to tonight's screening of the documentary film Disclosure. Disclosure takes us through a fascinating survey of cinematic history, showing how trans and gender nonconforming people have been depicted since film was invented and why it matters. This documentary was co-directed by Sam Feder and Amy Scholder, who will be joining us in just a moment for a live pre-screening discussion and Q&A. Plus, believe it or not, the one and only megastar, goddess, and icon, Laverne Cox. And the discussion will be moderated by the brilliant Oscar-nominated filmmaker, Yance Ford. Disclosure is a really inspiring, fascinating, and uplifting film, and some of you might have already seen it at Sundance, where it premiered last January, or on Netflix, where it's been streaming since June. But before we go to the discussion in the film, I just want to say why the film is important to me and to the Hammer Museum, and why I hope all of you watching will encourage as many of your friends and family as possible to see this film. A recent study by the GLAAD Foundation said that 80% of Americans don't personally know someone who is transgender. So as a result, for most of the country, all they know about transgender people is what they see in television and film. And those narratives end up shaping how transgender people are treated in all aspects of American life, including employment, healthcare, criminal justice, housing, school policies, policing, and national legislation. And the media also shapes how trans people see themselves. Sadly, many Americans trivialize or downplay trans rights issues, and this may include many people who see themselves as civil rights activists. But make no mistake, trans rights are human rights. Trans rights are civil rights. The very dangerous direct result of not including transgender people in every conversation about social justice is that they're disproportionately subjected to violent harassment and physical assault. In fact, last year, in 2020, at least 44 trans and gender nonconforming people were murdered in the United States. That's the highest number ever recorded. And almost all of them were people of color, and the majority were trans women. We cannot, as a nation, move forward when we're not supporting and protecting our most vulnerable. And that's why this film is so important. It's an analysis of the prism through which America sees trans people. It also shows trans people as they actually are, as loving partners, parents, family members, friends, and community members, as real people. And that's the goal, to combat the irrational hatred of trans people and let them access their needs and participate in society like everyone else. Hopefully, seeing this film will build a broad collective movement of trans allies who will make sure that trans rights are part of every human rights and civil rights conversation. So now we get to the fun part. In a minute, we'll bring on our incredible guest speakers, and the live discussion will be around 30 minutes. It will be followed by a screening of Disclosure. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions live here using the chat function on your screen. A quick technical note, if you're currently in full screen mode, you won't be able to see the chat. So if you want to participate, you need to exit full screen mode first, which you can usually do by pressing the escape key on your keyboard or by pressing the exit full screen button on the bottom of your screen. It's a little bit different on every web browser, so reach out for help if you need more instruction by exiting the video and clicking on the Need Help button. And now, please join me in welcoming Laverne Cox, Sam Feder, Amy Scholder, and Yance Ford.
Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Yance Ford, and I'm so glad that you could join us for the Hammer Museum discussion, pre-screening discussion of the film Disclosure. It is my honor to be joined today by the filmmaking team behind this extraordinary film. Sam Feder, director of Disclosure, Amy Scholder, the producer of the film Disclosure, and Laverne Cox, executive producer of Disclosure. Thank you so much for doing this, for being here, and for making the film. It's always so awkward having a discussion about a film that sort of generates so much discussion. You know, it's just I sort of feel like when I watch this film, I want to talk about everything at once immediately. And so I know some people haven't yet seen the film. Other folks have seen the film on Netflix where it's available. Please tell your friends, your families, your networks to check it out or enjoy the film after this discussion today. But I just I'll start with the basic question. Where did the idea for disclosure come from? Maybe Sam, you can take that first.
Sure. Hi, Yancy. It's
Okay.
always wonderful to see you. And I love that you're leading this conversation. I really can't think of anyone better to do that. And thank you, Hammer, for hosting us. It's wonderful to be in the Hammer community. You know, it's always interesting to answer that question because I always, it's like my whole life I've been thinking about disclosure in one way or the other. I grew up watching daytime talk shows in the 80s and 90s, and there was a plethora of people that were maybe trans people, maybe weren't, but sort of informed the way we understand trans people largely. And they were not flattering images, you'd see after school, day after day after day. One of the first movies I saw, one of the first images of a trans person I saw in a film was in The Crying Game. And I was 15, and it's an incredibly beautiful film, but there is that one scene where Dill, who is a trans woman, she disrobes in front of her boyfriend for the first time, and he, strikes her across the face and runs to the bathroom to vomit in what I think is like 50 seconds of screen time. And it was so burned into my brain. And even though I didn't have the language to understand my identity at the time, I certainly knew I did not want to be associated with someone whose body evoked vomiting. Then, in my early 20s, I started making films. And I think I really understood at that point, coming out of doing a lot of AIDS activism and doing a lot of photography, I understood how deeply media informs stigma. And when I started making films about trans issues, this was very much on my mind. And fast forward to 2014, Laverne Cox is on the cover of Time magazine. At this point, I'd been making films for about 10 years. And so seeing her on the cover was incredibly exciting, but then also this understanding of, as soon as a marginalized community gets mainstream attention, backlash ensues. So immediately I was in this space of paradox of, this excitement around the increase of visibility and a fear of a rise of social and legislative violence. And we saw that happen. And so understanding how to be in this liminal space, I think also opened up a lot of possibilities of questions to explore. And that was really the genesis of making Disclosure.
Laverne, let's pivot off of that 2014 cover of Time magazine, which I remember seeing and just, I still have my copy. And, I just remember being like, just feeling like there had been a flag planted, on the common ground of humanity. By your appearance on the cover of Time. Take us from that moment forward to your becoming involved in the film as executive producer.
Oh, wow. I mean, the Time magazine moment. It's funny, Sam mentions that a lot, and I don't often go back to what that felt like, and it's still kind of hard to process. But what's interesting to think about, this is a brief aside, is that I think in part ended up on the cover of Time magazine because of community response. There was an online poll earlier in the year in 2014 where Time magazine asked people who should be in the Time 100. And at one point, for maybe 2 hours, I was #1 ahead of Justin Bieber. And the polls changed. And so it's #1 for a while, and then, obviously Justin Bieber went back to #1. But there was like Laverne Cox is being talked about. And then I didn't make the Time 100 that year. And then there was this sort of online outrage around it. Where's Laverne Cox? And it got kind of big. And lo and behold, Time magazine reaches out a few months later, and they're like, would you like to do a cover try? And I was like, well, yes. And so it's really, when I think about that moment, even though I was on that cover by myself, I felt like there was a community behind me and with me, and I was on that cover because of my community. And so going forward from that and just trying to sort of build a career, but also been very interested in how we have conversations with and about trans people. That's something I've been deeply interested in for a very long time. Way before I met Sam, I was doing a presentation on the history of how trans people were represented on TV talk shows. I did that presentation in a few different places, and I showed clips, and I was like, okay, this is the narrative that's sort of being created here. What's this about? And so I've always wanted to make a movie that sort of dealt with how trans people were represented on screen, sort of inspired by the celluloid closet or by ethnic notions, films like that. And in 2017, when I happened to go to an event at Outfest, and Sam was giving a presentation of the research that would become Disclosure, it felt shared. It felt like I was there for a reason. I had never really sort of gone to an event. It was just so random that I was even there. It had to be for a reason that was bigger than me. And it really was, because here we are, 4 years later.
Amazing. So Amy, here we are 4 years later. And Disclosure is one of the most talked about films of the year, since it landed at Sundance in January of 2020. Talk about what it took to bring this really ambitious, incredibly important examination. I won't call it a survey, because it's not actually a survey film, right? It's something much broader, much deeper, much more meaningful than that. Talk about bringing together this extraordinary film.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that question, Nancy, and thank you for being here. And I just also want to shout out and thank Claudia Bester and Annie Philbin at the Hammer for having us, and our another executive producer, Michael Sherman, for getting us here. We really are so honored to be part of this program. I met Sam years ago when his film Kate Bornstein is a Queer in Pleasant Danger was just premiering in New York, and I loved it so much. It was a beautiful depiction of my friend Kate Bornstein, and was lucky enough to be able to bring it to the Hammer, and we brought Kate and Sam here to LA and screened it. And when Sam told me about the research he was doing for what would become Disclosure in 2014-15, I knew how important this film would be. I remembered seeing The Celluloid Closet when it was premiered at the Frameline Film Festival in San Francisco, and just how important that was in my life and my community at that time, coming out of a lot of trauma around AIDS and the stigma around being queer and the AIDS epidemic, and seeing that film about the history of the closet in Hollywood was so cathartic. And when Sam told me about making this film now, I mean, at that time, 5 years ago, pre-Trump, it was, it in a way was a lifetime ago, but I knew how important that would be. And I said, what can I do to help? This is my first producing credit. I really didn't know what I didn't know. And it turns out it was an enormous challenge to get this film made. We were ambitious from the start. I mean, from every idea that, like, wow, wouldn't it be incredible if Laverne Cox could be a part of this project? How are we going to make that happen? And then, as Laverne said, we had that Bashert moment, meeting her at Outfest and joining forces. Funding was incredibly challenging, as it is for all filmmakers, but our budget was big because we insisted on paying everybody. Mm-hmm. And we had a fellowship program that was part of our production model, and we paid our fellows. It was, the first several years was really about supporting Sam's research and crewing up and finding an amazing team to shoot our interviews. And then, as we had more to show for this project than the pitch that Sam and I would do verbally, we got more and more people on board. And really the last 2 years was about just collecting an incredible group of people, which included, of course, you, Yance, as one of our creative consultants, and our amazing team of executive producers came on and so forth. So it has been a journey to sum it up.
Amazing. One of the things that and any one of you can take this question. In documentary film, there's always the question of the voice of authority in the film and where the authority sits. And one of the things about disclosure that is so distinct is that trans voices are the voices of authority in the film. There are no outside experts that get sort of teleported into the frame to validate or reconfirm the experiences of the trans folk who are on camera in the film. Sam, tell me about making that choice because it's a choice that every filmmaker makes. Like, who should have the authority in the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think every trans person has the experience of this ubiquitous infantilization of people constantly talking about or for us, debating our right to public space, debating our rights to healthcare, right to housing, to employment, whether we can play on sports teams constantly. And I've always felt this way with my films that no one's going to speak about trans people except trans people, and then also this idea of experts that we prioritize in documentaries, this very sort of imperialist idea, this colonialist notion of, the outsider coming in and talking about another community. I mean, that's just something I've resisted my whole career. And so with this film in particular, there was this sort of assumption that there would be, renowned historians, film critics, like people outside of the trans community talking about this subject, particularly because it had not been documented before. And that was never something I was going to ever budge on. Like, this was a history that was going to be told for the first time with a new lens, looking at material that so many of us are so familiar with. Mm-hmm. And the experts are the people who live the life of being trans. And so that I knew that was the only way this film would reach an audience in the most visceral way, right? And not only is it only trans people that we see talking as the voice of authority, but we prioritize hiring trans people behind the scenes as well, because we know that there's nothing accidental, right, that happens. So every frame, every lighting decision, every way someone's mic'd, every question, every way someone's looked at in response informs the feeling of the film. So on both sides of the camera, trans people are the experts, and I think that's how any history should be told.
Talk a bit about the creative consultants. Which in another film might be called a cast, or might be referred to as characters, right? One of the incredible things about being a part of this film was that the structure of the film was built entirely around acknowledging the contributions of everyone who sat in front of the camera, as well as lifting up and supporting and forefronting trans talent behind the camera as well. Can you talk about the voices that you brought together to appear on screen in Disclosure, because it's an incredible sampling. Can't think of another word tonight. It's an incredible, just sort of, example of how diverse our community is, as well as how diverse our experiences are.
I mean, the thing I love most about being trans is we live at the intersection of every identity that a human being can have, right? Every age, sex, gender, ability, religion, ethnicity, nationality, class, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, we see so many trans narratives that are about one person, one experience that's supposed to speak for so many experiences you can't possibly speak for. And I think what's so exciting about being trans is this opportunity to look at the world from such a prism, right, of experiences. And, we're a small community and we know a lot of us know each other, right? And I think that's also such a testament to nothing about us without us, right? Like the fact that Laverne and I have been part of this community, have been talking to so many people that we see for many years about these issues, and have been friends with so many of the people that you see in the film, is what also makes it so intimate. you know, and when I started the film, the first thing I did was oral histories, research interviews with about 60 to 70 trans people to start to collect the database, right? So from the beginning, this was a communal process, you know, that the nexus was really based in the memories and perspectives and experiences of trans people. And, you know, it's not easy to make a documentary with 30 trans voices, but I think our editor did a phenomenal job. And I think you really get to know a lot of people and you see their growth because it's because the structure is so rooted in these personal experiences that came up on set.
Yeah. Laverne, was there anything that came up in the research, either in the making of the film or even back to the original presentation that you saw in 2017 at Outfest, that surprised you? Was there anything that surprised you in in a positive way?
Positive, I generally don't like to get into any kind of binary as positive versus negative. I think I was definitely surprised that there was so much, that how far back the footage went. I just remember being just sort of awestruck by Sam's presentation, that there was so much black and white footage where we can begin to track the story that began to unfold about trans people, right? That even though the term transgender wasn't around in 1903 or 1913, gendered cross-dressing was, and narratives about people who might do that were developing because of those images. Also because of the criminalization that we talk about in the film, the criminalization of gendered cross-dressing that was happening at the time. And so, I love Susan Stryker's, this is a bit of a spoiler for the people who haven't seen it, but I'll be vague. But Susan Stryker has a beautiful moment when she talks about a film called Judith of Bethulia, and how it is often thought that film is the first time that the sort of dynamic cut advanced the narrative, right? And that there was a trans person in that narrative, I think is really, really exciting. I love the idea. I love the fact that trans and gender nonconforming people have been around since the very beginning of cinema, that we've been there the whole time is very, very, very exciting. And I also wanted to say too, I've been thinking a lot about looking and who's looking and how we look. And so many of the choices that went into this film, both consciously and I think unconsciously, is about a new way of looking, a trans lens, if you will, an oppositional gaze, that to sort of quote Bell Hooks. How are we looking, and how do we see differently? And this film, through the lens of the creative consultants who are trans and their personal lived experiences and stories, provides all of us an opportunity to see differently. I think I was also really deeply moved and surprised by our other people's, takes on films that I had my own takes on. I think Yance, some of the things that you said about Birth of a Nation and D.W. Griffith, and what Rain said about Soap Dish, and all of these things, it's like that things I hadn't thought about that were really, really exciting. And so it's like this space of having a critical relationship to the images that we consume and see, particularly when we have lived experiences around those images, is really, really exciting. And I think it's an opportunity for us to begin to maybe imagine other ways of seeing after we see Disclosure.
So this is another question from the audience. I believe Corey Ray, and Amy, I'll ask this of you. Will there be a Disclosure 2? I feel like this is jumping a little bit to the end of the conversation, but there is so much material. You have so much material. You're at this moment in time with the movie. Are you thinking about gifting us all a sequel to Disclosure?
At this minute, I'm not thinking about a sequel, but we, when we were younger and fresher in this process, we were definitely thinking about the
when I was young.
yes, like I think we were aware when we started cutting, especially, once we were in the editing process, it was like, wow, I mean, this could be a 10-part series. This could be the first of 1, 2, 3 other films. Whether, I don't know whether, we'll do it, this team will do it. Certainly there will be another disclosure kind of look in my hopes and dreams. Yes, there will be another disclosure. It's so interesting when, at a certain point the pencils have to, you have to put it down, you have to wrap up the film, you have to send it to Sundance. And even after that, we opened it back up, and while we were waiting to get a sale, it's just, and made some last minute changes. But, at a certain point you stop, and then it becomes, it has its mark in time. Mm. So, and so much has been changing, so much changes all the time.
Caroline Labresco, who's one of the executive producers of the film as well, has said that disclosure made her care about trans issues in a way she never had. And, even over the past couple of days, we've seen another wave of legislation around the country looking to attack trans youth. And people rising up to defend trans youth from these very coordinated, orchestrated attacks on the local, school board and state level. Why is it important that disclosure can change perceptions? We're in the last hours of a presidency that has seen unprecedented attacks from the federal branch, from the executive branch rather, and the judicial branch on trans people. Why is it, or how do you think disclosure can help people, maybe realize that they know someone that they didn't think they knew before, or consider or reconsider supporting some of these new rules that are looking to exclude trans athletes from competition when they're, just so young that it makes me want to cry thinking about targeting our young people like that.
I think this is intense. Most of my public life, I've been sort of, talking about state legislatures or talking about public policies that are targeting trans folks. I think that what disclosure provides is an opportunity to change the narrative. When you look at the bills that are introduced, when you look at, we're reading amicus briefs, believe it or not, reading amicus briefs for like the Title VII Supreme Court case and all the sort of fear mongering that happens around the ways in which people talk about trans folks. With disclosure, we address a lot of those things. We address a lot of the sort of fear mongering and misinformation that has persisted about trans people for a very long time. And I just like to remind people that feeling uncomfortable is not necessarily feeling unsafe. The ways in which the lives of particularly trans women are being sort of pitted against cis women in sports and women's spaces is so deeply troubling. I can't help but think about the bathroom issue, right? That was, they moved from bathrooms to sporting teams. And in the South, in the segregated South, during Jim Crow, a lot of white people obviously were very uncomfortable with the idea of using the same bathrooms as Black folks. Mm-hmm. But just because we were all the idea of going to the bathroom didn't necessarily make them unsafe, but it made them uncomfortable. Trans women being in, so-called women's spaces doesn't make cis women unsafe. It might make them uncomfortable, but that's not trans people's problem. And trans people should not be sort of scapegoated and denied liberty and rights because someone else is uncomfortable. And so the divide and conquer thing, I can't help but think about as well, that like power often uses strategies of divide and conquer to divide marginalized people, and the way in which cis women are being pitted against trans women right now is really, really sad, because we all really need to be in this together. And Disclosure, what's been so beautiful is seeing how much support from cis women we've gotten with this film, and so how much encouragement from people across the board who have had their eyes opened about the beautiful humanity of trans people. And I think in continuing to insist on the humanity in representations like Disclosure, I mean, there's so much beautiful humanity in our film that if we continue to insist on the humanity of trans people, then we can maybe, beat down the sort of misinformation and attempts to dehumanize us.
Indeed. You were all very, very intentional about making sure that the crew was trans and that opportunities were given to trans folk who didn't necessarily have the work experience to come on board as crew and be mentored by more experienced craftspeople and technicians and people who are responsible for making film. Why is it important for us to be training up the next generation of trans filmmakers?
I mean, trans people are disproportionately underemployed across every industry. I think trans people are 3 times more likely to be unemployed, 4 times if you're a trans person of color. I mean, so this is an issue across all types of work. And when we're talking about storytelling, I don't even know how to make it specific to Hollywood, quite honestly. I think we need to create opportunities, and you cannot create opportunities around unpaid internships. That's limited to very, very few privileged people. And so a mentorship where you're actually learning skills, you're networking, and you're being paid is the only way to create future opportunities when we say we want to see change in any industry. And there's all this talk about diversifying and creating more opportunities, but then you hear people say we can't find the right person, they don't have the right experience. I mean, you have to put your attention to where your intention is. Making a film is really, really hard. Nothing about making a film is easy. So if you say you want to see films and different people behind the scenes making the films, you have to pay it forward. You have to create those opportunities on your set, and I think anyone who's been at any job for, say, more than 2 or 3 years should mentor someone else, whoever that person is, wherever their interests are. I think I would love to see a society where that is just part of our workforce.
I believe it or not, that we are out of time.
Really?
I don't want to delay the Hammer Museum's audience in seeing the film. So I will say, does anyone have any final thoughts they want to share with the audience?
Wish we could all be together, but thank you so much for supporting and coming out to watch tonight.
Yes, thank you, and enjoy the film. Enjoy the film. Enjoy the film. Thank you.
Thank you, Yance.
Laverne Cox, executive producer; Amy Scholder, producer; Sam Feder, director. The film is Disclosure. Enjoy your screening this evening. The film is also available on Netflix. Tell your friends, tell your families, tell your colleagues to find the film, discover the film, share the word, share the film, spread the word. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to the Hammer for having me. Good night.